Medi-Cal, educational funding is being cut. One could go on and on. But the empire, in other words, feeds off the republic. That's where the empire gets its resources. It gets its money, it gets its materials, it gets its manpower, or troop power, we should say. And this is a process that's driven by rational self-interest. A political writer named Lawrence McGuire, he was trying to understand international finance and the catastrophe that overtook Argentina. Remember back about 10 years ago, a total burnout, free fall in Argentina. The whole economy collapsed. And he read three liberal writers. He read Mark Cooper of The Nation, and Mark Cooper is a guy who never met a U.S. war that he didn't like. He supported the invasion of Panama. He supported the first Gulf War. He supports the war in Iraq. And he writes for a progressive magazine called The Nation. And the other two liberal writers were Mark Weisbrot and Paul Krugman of the New York Times, all of them writing on Argentina. And all three of them said that Argentina had been a gold mine for international investors and big speculators, a source of huge multi-billion-dollar profits. The IMF forced Argentina to slash its protective tariffs, privatize its state enterprises, and transfer huge sums from Argentina taxpayers to the pockets of the big money people who control the IMF. That's called, SAPs, structural adjustment programs, where you get the country to spend less on the social needs of the country, consume less, work harder, so they have more money to pay the debt. So, McGuire notes that Cooper, Weisbrot, and Krugman condemn the crisis in Argentina. Okay, good. And they say that the IMF created a failed model. The program was an error, a catastrophic failure, a failed experiment. These are all quotes. A disaster. But Larry McGuire says, how can that be? How is it a disaster? Agreed, it was a major disaster for the Argentine people. But the free market IMF policies made Wall Street cheer, as Krugman himself said, and reaped billions of dollars in investment. The policy worked very well for a small group of wealthy people. Isn't that what the policy was supposed to do? The IMF has pursued these same policies in many other countries. If an institution does the same thing over and over again with profitable results, why is it a disaster? Why is it a failure? Because it brought hardship to the people of these countries? What's that got to do with getting rich? As McGuire puts it, I would call it a well-crafted policy that must work for the people implementing that policy. Otherwise, why would they continue doing it? What's experimental about it? Paul Krugman's term. This is an experimental policy that has failed. What's experimental about it? It's been going on for 30 years. So why do Cooper, Weisbrot, and Krugman call it a failure? I'm going to tell you why right now. Because they want to stay within the dominant paradigm. They prefer to make a liberal complaint rather than a radical analysis. They assume a community of interest between the plutocratic investors and the working people of the recipient countries, when in fact there is no community of interest. They assume that the rich plunderers who make billions off the IMF are primarily interested in helping others rather than in helping themselves. They avoid all mention of cui bono, the Roman expression, the Latin expression, cui bono, who benefits, who gets it, and who pays. And the same, by the way, you can say for the war in Iraq. The same you could say, by the way, for all U.S. overseas investments, all U.S. aid to countries, all U.S. loans to countries. The one thing that's happened in the last 50 years is that these investments, loans, and aid have increased tremendously. And yet poverty has increased in these countries. Poverty today is spreading at a faster rate than the world's population. There are more people, let me put it this way, the number of people living in poverty is growing at a faster rate than the world's population. So poverty is spreading. So how could that be? It's because these loans, these investments, and this aid was not designed to uplift the people in these countries. When one of the Fortune 500 goes to Indonesia or some other place or Africa to invest, they're not going on a social welfare mission to uplift people. They're going to make money off the labor, the land, the markets, and the resources of that country. The same, as I said, started to say for the war in Iraq, and I'll wind it down here. We find out that the reasons given by the administration to justify the war prove false. Weapons of mass destruction, Al-Qaeda links, all that stuff. That doesn't mean the policy is imbecilic. Because our U.S. rulers try to mislead and confuse us, doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves are confused or misled. The war in Iraq is not a stupid blunder. It's not a well-intentioned undertaking that went wrong. Iraq has been very good for a number of interests. It served notice to the Middle East and the world that countries that chart an independent, self-defining, and self-developing course will be destroyed. It's letting you know that they're making the world safe for the free market global empire. That anybody who wants to use the land, labor, resources, and markets outside of this free market global system is going to be delivered this way. Also, 100 companies make billions of dollars in government contracts. They've walked away with immense profits, much of it totally unaccountable. The Pentagon itself, the U.S. Department of Defense, admits that about 1/3 of all the monies, the billions it's been handing out, it cannot account for. It doesn't know where it goes. That's a lot of very well-placed people getting very rich. The war has allowed the U.S. administration to increase military spending by some 30 to 40%, depending on how you calculate the U.S. defense budget. Iraq has 113 billion barrels of top quality crude. That is, there's no shale in it, it's very close to the surface, so it's low cost to get it out of the ground and all that. That oil, Saddam Hussein was making concessions, exploration concessions with all sorts of other countries like Russia, China, Italy, France, Brazil, Malaysia. All those concessions and agreements are off the board. It's just the U.S. and Great Britain now who have the concessions on the oil. Iraq has, well, under Saddam Hussein, Iraq switched from dollars to euros for its reserve currency. That's a terrible example. If all the oil-producing countries start switching to the euro, the dollar is going to collapse, and that would mean a loss to billions of dollar creditors and speculators and such. Not anymore. Iraq is back on the dollar. Iraq supported Palestinian liberation. Not anymore. All that aid has stopped. Iraq, this is all before the invasion, Iraq had an entirely state-owned economy. Not anymore. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld made I thought, a very amusing statement. He called the Iraq economy a Stalinized economy. In other words, it was publicly owned. Not anymore. Everything has been privatized or smashed by the war. Iraq was, by the way, prosperous before the first Gulf Wars. It had the highest standard of living in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein, who had been put into power by the CIA, by the way, that's amnesia, that nobody talks about that anymore. But now Iraq is no longer taking a self-defining, self-developing alternative role. It is now probably one of the most impoverished, desperate country in the world, especially since the revenue from its own oil will probably not be going to it anymore. This is, I would suggest to you, this is deliberate, conscious reactionism and imperialism. Bush and Cheney and their gang knew what they wanted to do, and they did it. They, of course, did miscalculate grievously. They thought it would be a walk. They would get in there, knock out the opposition in a few weeks, set up a puppet government, and then run it exactly the way they wanted. They miscalculated there very seriously, and it's been politically very costly for them. But that doesn't mean they didn't accomplish anything. That doesn't mean that it was a failed policy, that it was just that it was a well-intended policy, that suddenly George Bush just got an urge in his bosom to go help the Iraqi people and teach them democracy. I mean, they had a democratic revolution in 1958. They had a pluralistic, diverse revolution. And they took over ownership of the oil industry, kicked out British Petroleum and all the American companies. And it was the CIA, Saddam Hussein's first gig with the CIA was to shoot the prime minister of Iraq. Didn't kill him, he messed it up, and they quickly ushered him off to Syria. But in time, he rose in the Ba'athist Party. He murdered, tortured, or exiled, or drove underground every single Democrat, constitutionalist, reformer, progressive, communist, whatever. Got them all. He even wiped out the whole left wing of his own Ba'athist Party. And in those days, he was Washington's poster boy. They couldn't love him enough. They even signed him onto Iraq for a war. It's only when he started getting out of line on the oil quotas and oil prices, it's only when he started refusing to privatize, it's only when he started saying Iraq for the Iraqis and all that sort of thing. He was a right-winger, reactionary, militarist, but he also was a statist and was committing the crime of economic nationalism, which the globalists, the empire builders, could not countenance. Okay, just two more questions, then I'll stop here. Do those who put forth the lies of empire believe what they tell us? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That an opinion, that an opinion so serves one's self-interest, that really behind it is this tremendous self-interest, doesn't mean the opinion is hypocritically embraced. It may mean that it's all the more sincerely embraced because it so does serve your self-interest. It must be true, it must be right, and you definitely believe it. You find it very persuasive for the very fact that it is so serviceable. Now, at what exact psychological point rationalizations and self-serving or hypocritical opinions become sincerely embraced, I don't know, and I'm not sure that's such an important question. But the people who rule North America do believe in the dominant paradigm. It defines their world for them. It assures them of their self-worth. They believe that the country, as Alexander Hamilton, an American founding father of 200 years ago, said, the country should be ruled by the rich and the well-born. They believe that. They don't openly say that too often in this age of democracy. They completely believe they are deserving of their station in life. As was said about George Bush, he was born on third base and he grew up thinking he hit a triple. If you know baseball, you know what that is. Oh, how could you work that into a hockey analogy? I know, and I'm discovering Canadians who don't follow hockey. I've got to get my stereotype right. These ruling interests believe that America should lead the world and that they should lead America, and they believe the poor are the authors of their own poverty, and the working class are a troublesome lot who need to be reined in along with the middle class, both of whom have to ratchet down their standard of living a lot more so that those at the top can get still richer and richer and richer. And now do they believe the propaganda they put out in support of specific policies? Sometimes they do, and sometimes they deliberately fabricate. I mean, you can catch them when they're contradicting themselves and saying this on one day and then this on the next day. But you see, much of the time, truth is not even a consideration. It's very much like the advertising world. There is no truth. It's the approach to the truth is purely manipulative. It's purely instrumental. If